I have buried 3 men in my life, and I have never once been able to tell you what any of them were thinking in the moment they went. That is the honest trouble with people. You can ride beside a man for a decade, share his coffee and his silences, watch him flinch at thunder and laugh at his own bad luck, and still not know the one thing he carried in the deepest pocket of himself. I learned that the hard way on a road so dry it had forgotten what rain felt like. The summer I found a stranger's wallet lying open in the dirt like a hand that had let go of something. You are going to want to know what was inside it. So did I, but before I tell you, you should understand something, because it matters to how the rest of this went. I am not a good man in the way the word usually gets used. I am a stubborn one. When I want to leave a thing alone, I can leave it alone for years. And when I decide I cannot, no wall built by God or bank or grieving family has ever kept me out. That wallet asked me a question I did not want answered. What I found on the other side of it changed how I think about a woman I never met, a boy who was not my son, and a promise that a dying man made to nobody in particular on the worst night of his life. Stay with me, this is not a story about money. It never was. The horse smelled it before I did. Cinnamon, that was the mare's name, though she was the color of wet rust and had never once been sweet, stopped dead in the middle of the road and put her ears forward the way she did when a snake was sunning itself somewhere she did not intend to step. I sat there a moment and let her have her opinion. Out here you learn to. A horse that lives has better instincts than a man who thinks, and I had spent enough years watching men who thought get themselves killed to know which of us to trust. It was the tail end of July, and the whole country had gone the color of an old bone. The grass that came up green in April had cured to straw and then to nothing, and the road ran through it straight and pale as a scar. There was no sound but the flies and the small tick of heat coming off the ground, and somewhere far behind me, a windmill I could no longer see turning in a wind I could no longer feel. I had been 3 days out of cold water with a string of 2 remounts and a saddlebag of jerky gone hard as shoe leather. And I was tired in the specific way that a man gets tired when he is riding away from a thing he did not want to be part of, and toward a thing he has not yet named. I will get to that. The thing I was riding away from, it has its place in this. Cinnamon snorted and sidestepped, and that was when I saw it. A dark shape at the edge of the road, half in the ditch, and my first ugly thought was that it was a body, because I have found bodies on roads before and the mind goes where it has been. But it was too small. I swung down, and my knees told me about it, and I walked over on legs that had forgotten how to be legs, and I crouched, and it was a wallet. A good one, that surprised me. Not the flat cheap billfold a working man carries, the kind that molds to your hip and finally splits along the fold, but a real thing, hand-stitched, the leather tooled with a pattern of oak leaves gone soft and dark with handling. Someone had loved this wallet. Someone had carried it a long time and rubbed the oil of their own hands into it year after year until it took on that particular glow that only comes from being held. It lay open in the dirt with its mouth up to the sky, and the wind had put a fine skin of dust over everything inside, and it looked, God help me, like something that had been dropped in a great hurry by someone who was not coming back for it. I should tell you what I did not do, because it is the more honest part. I did not immediately think of the person who lost it. I thought of the money. I am not proud of that, but I would be a liar to leave it out, and I have decided somewhere along the way that a story told by a liar is not worth the breath. I was broke. Not the temporary broke of a man between jobs, but the settled, structural broke of a man who has made a career of the wrong decisions and is beginning to suspect he will die still making them. I thumbed the wallet open the rest of the way, and there was money in it, more than I expected, folded twice. I did not count it then, but I would later, and it was $91, which in that year and that country was closer to a month's wages than I like to admit. And for a long moment, crouched in the ditch with the flies finding the sweat on my neck, I thought about keeping it. I want you to sit with that because I did. I thought about how nobody had seen me. I thought about how a wallet on a road like this belonged to whoever the road gave it to, and the road had given it to me. I thought about a warm meal in the next town and a real bed and maybe a bottle, and I felt the pull of it in my chest the way you feel the pull of a river you know is deeper than it looks. Then I saw the photograph. It was tucked behind a fold, a small square gone brown at the edges, and I slid it out with 2 fingers because something made me. A woman, not young, not old, standing in front of a plank house with her hands folded in front of her apron and her chin up in that way people held themselves for photographs back when a photograph cost money and mattered. She was not smiling. People did not then. But there was something in the set of her mouth. I have tried 100 times to name it, and the closest I can come is that she looked like a woman who had decided to endure something and had not yet told anyone. Beside her, half a step back, stood a boy of maybe 9, and he was smiling, the gap-toothed, reckless smile of a child who has not yet learned what his mother already knows. On the back, in a careful, laboring hand, the hand of someone for whom writing did not come easy, it said, "For when you forget our faces, come home, Silas, we are waiting." I put the money back. I want that on the record too. I did not decide anything grand. I did not have a change of heart in some clean cinematic way. I just found, sitting there in the dust, that I could no longer hold the money and the photograph in the same 2 hands and the photograph won, and I did not fully understand why, and I still do not. There was a name in the wallet which is more than you usually get. A folded letter, water-stained, addressed to a Silas Renner, care of a ranch I had never heard of, in a county 2 over from where I stood. And there were other things, the small archaeology of a man's pockets, a pressed flower, dry as paper, a coin with a hole bored through it on a string, a child's tooth wrapped in a scrap of blue cloth. Men do not carry a child's tooth unless the child is either very loved or very lost, and sometimes both, and I began to feel that I had opened something I had no right to open, the way you feel when you walk into a room and realize a moment too late that someone in it has been crying. I sat back on my heels and looked down the road both ways. Empty. It is a particular kind of empty, that country, an empty that has weight to it, that presses. A wallet does not fall out of a saddlebag onto the exact center of a road and lie open. A wallet gets thrown, or dropped by a hand that has stopped working, or set down by a man who means to pick it up again and then, for one reason or another, does not. I looked at the ground and there was no sign. The wind had taken it all, but I have tracked enough to know that the ground telling you nothing is itself a kind of telling. Whatever happened here happened days ago. I could have ridden on. I want to be clear that this was a live option and I considered it with real seriousness. I owed this Silas Renner nothing. I did not know him. I had my own trouble waiting for me up the road, the trouble I have been not quite mentioning, and a wise man tends his own trouble and lets the dead bury the dead. But I am not a wise man. I have established this. I have a habit, my late wife called it a curse, and she was not entirely wrong, of needing to know how things end. Not how I want them to end. How they actually do. It has cost me work and friendships and once very nearly my life, this needing, and I have never been able to put it down. And crouched there with a stranger's tooth in a blue rag in my palm, I felt the old needing come up in me like water rising in a well, and I knew before I stood that I was going to find out who Silas Renner was and what had happened to him, and I knew it was probably a mistake, and I got on my horse and went anyway. The nearest town was a place called Ash Fork, though there was no fork and the ash had all blown away years ago, and it was the kind of town that exists mostly as a reason for the road to slow down before it speeds up again. One street, a store that was also the post office that was also, when the man behind the counter felt like it, the bank, a church with its paint gone, a saloon that did not have a name because everyone already knew where it was. I tied cinnamon and went into the store because the store meant the postmaster, and the postmaster, in a country like that, is the closest thing there is to a memory. He was an old man, thin as a fence rail, with spectacles mended at the bridge with wire, and a way of looking at you over the top of them that made you feel he had already decided what kind of man you were, and was only waiting to be proven right. I set the wallet on the counter, closed, and I said I had found it on the road east of town and I was looking for the man it belonged to. I gave the name, Silas Renner. I have thought many times since about the way the old man's face changed. It did not fall exactly. It did something quieter and worse. A kind of settling, the way a house settles years after the people have gone. A small collapse you would not notice unless you were watching the whole structure. He took off his spectacles and folded them and set them down with great care, buying himself a moment, and I let him have it because I have needed such moments myself. "Where did you say you found it?" he said, not a question, a way of not answering mine. I told him again. He picked up the wallet and turned it over in his hands, and he ran his thumb over the tooled oak leaves the way you touch a thing you recognize, and I understood then that he knew it, that he had maybe seen it 100 times riding on the hip of a man he knew, and I felt the floor of the thing drop out from under me a little, because a wallet you recognize on a stranger's counter is never good news. "You'd best sit down," he said, "and you'd best not be the kind of man who repeats what he hears." I sat down. I told him I was not that kind of man. It was, at the time, mostly true. His name was Elmore, the postmaster, though I did not learn it until later, and what he told me over the next hour, in pieces, circling it the way a man circles a fire he is afraid to look at directly, was this. Silas Renner had ranched a hard quarter of land out past the breaks for going on 20 years, came from somewhere back east that he never named, arrived with a wife and a wagon and not much else, and made a go of it the way people did then, badly, and with enormous effort and by degrees. The woman in the photograph was his wife. Her name was Mercy, which Elmore said without irony, and there had been the boy, and there had been, Elmore said and then stopped and started again. There had been a fever 3 winters back that took the boy and very nearly took Mercy, and something in Silas had gone out with it, the way a lamp goes out, all at once and without a sound. He had kept ranching. That was the thing Elmore kept coming back to, turning the wallet in his hands. He had kept getting up. Mercy had grown strange with grief, would not leave the house, would not have the boy's things touched, and Silas had let her, had taken to sleeping in the barn so she could have the house and her ghosts to herself, and he had gone on branding and mending fence and hauling water like a man carrying a stone up a hill for no reason, but that setting it down had become unthinkable. And then, Elmore said, and here he set the wallet down flat on the counter and put his hand over it, about a week ago Mercy took sick again. Same fever. Went through here fast, 3 families lost somebody. And Silas rode for the doctor in Coldwater, which is a day and a half if you kill your horse doing it, and he did just about kill his horse, and he stopped. He looked at me over the wire-mended spectacles, and there was something in his face that I did not understand until much later, a kind of pleading, as if he wanted me to already know so he would not have to say it. "The doctor came," Elmore said. "The doctor's out there now, but Silas never came back with him. And 3 days ago the Hendricks boy found Silas's horse standing saddled and alone by the river crossing east of here, with the girth loose and the stirrups run up like it had been left, not thrown from. And no Silas. And now you walk in here with his wallet that he never in 20 years set down, that his wife stitched him the first winter they were married, and you found it lying open in the road." The store was very quiet. Outside a dog barked twice and gave up. "So you tell me," Elmore said, and his voice was not unkind, only exhausted, the voice of a man who has run out of ways to arrange bad facts into a shape he can live with. "You tell me what a man's supposed to make of that." I did not have an answer for him. I have made a life of not having answers, and only rarely has it cost me as much as it did in that moment, sitting on a nail keg in a dim store with a dead boy's tooth in my saddlebag, and the beginnings of something cold and certain moving in my gut. Because here is what I did not tell Elmore, and what I have not told anyone until now. The road where I found the wallet was not east of town. It was west. It was on the far side of Ash Fork entirely, in the wrong direction, in a direction that made no sense for a man riding home to a sick wife from the river crossing. Silas Renner's horse had been found east. His wallet had been found by me a full day's ride west, and a wallet does not travel that distance on the wind. Someone had moved it, or someone had been moving on foot west away from home, away from the wife, away from everything, carrying the wallet and then dropping it, or setting it down open in the middle of the road where it was certain to be found. And I sat there and I thought about the note on the back of the photograph. "Come home, Silas. We are waiting." And I thought about a man who slept in a barn for 3 years so his wife could keep company with the dead. And I thought about the particular way a wallet lies when it has been set down on purpose by a man who has decided he is not going to need it anymore. And I felt the whole shape of the thing loom up out of the dark like a house you did not know was there, until the lightning showed it to you. I stood up. Elmore watched me. "I'm going to find him," I said. "He's likely dead," Elmore said, gently, the way you tell a child a hard thing. "Then I'm going to find that out," I said. And I meant it, and I did not fully understand yet that in going to find out what had happened to Silas Renner, I was going to find out something about myself that I had spent 20 years riding hard to keep from ever having to look at. But that comes later. That is the part I have not told. For now it is enough to say that I took the wallet back off the counter and Elmore let me, which surprised me, and he said one more thing as I went out the door into the white hammer of the afternoon. He said, "Mister, whatever you find out there," and he stopped, and he tried again. "There's a woman in that house who's already buried a son. Be careful what you carry back to her." I told him I would. That was the first promise I broke. I want to end this first part by telling you about the river crossing, because it is where part 1 ends, and it is where I began to understand that I had ridden into something I could not ride back out of unchanged. I got there at dusk. The river was low, brown, moving without conviction, the kind of river that is mostly the memory of a river. The horse Elmore had described was gone. Someone had taken it in. But the ground still held the story if you knew how to read it, and I knew how to read it. I got down and walked the bank in the failing light, and I found where Silas had watered his horse, and where he had stood a long time, longer than a man stands to water a horse, the boot prints deep and close together like a man rooted to a spot by a thought he could not get past. And I found where he had loosed the girth and run up the stirrups, which is a thing you do to a horse you are turning loose, a thing you do when you are done with it. And I found where his own tracks went on alone, on foot, west into the breaks, in the exact direction that a day and a half later would put a wallet lying open in a road for a stranger to find. And I found one thing more, and it is the thing I carried down into the dark of that night and have carried ever since. Halfway between the water and the place where his tracks turned west, there was a patch of soft sand, and in it, pressed deep and clear, a single knee print. One knee. A man had knelt there in the dark, alone by a river, with his horse turned loose behind him and his home behind that, and he had knelt down in the sand, to pray, or to weep, or simply because his legs would no longer hold him up under the weight of whatever he was carrying. And then he had gotten up, because the knee print was single and there was no sign that he had fallen. And he had walked on west into country a man does not walk into unless he has stopped expecting to walk back out. I knelt down beside his knee print in the last of the light. I don't know why, to measure it against my own maybe, to see if a stranger's despair would fit the shape of mine. It fit, God help me, it fit exactly. And that is where I made camp, and did not sleep, and waited for a light I could track by, and thought about all the roads a broken man can take when he decides he is done, and understood for the first time that I was not tracking Silas Renner at all. I was tracking the version of myself I had turned loose at a river of my own, years ago, and never gone looking for. In the morning I would follow him west. In the morning everything would change. I have crossed a lot of bad country in my life, and I will tell you that the breaks west of Ash Fork were the worst of it, and not because they were the harshest. I have been in harsher. They were the worst because they were quiet in a way that felt personal, as if the land had been waiting a long time for someone foolish enough to come in, and had decided to say nothing at all until it was too late to leave. I picked up Silas's trail at first light where it turned off from the river, and it held for the first mile, clear enough, the long, unhurried stride of a man walking not toward anything but simply away. Then the ground went to rock and shale, and the trail became a thing I found in pieces, a scuffed stone here, a broken stem of greasewood there, once, heartbreakingly, a place where he had sat down against a boulder, the print of his back and his 2 boot heels dug in, and had stayed a while, and had gotten up again. I put my own back against that same boulder and looked out at what he would have looked at, and it was nothing, miles of broken nothing, and I could not for the life of me understand why a man would walk into it, until I remembered that I had done my own version of exactly this, and that from the inside it does not feel like walking into nothing. It feels like the only direction left. By noon the heat was a physical weight and cinnamon was blowing, and I was out of the last of my water, and I had begun to understand that I was not going to catch a living man. 3 days is a long time to be out here on foot. A man does not survive 3 days in the breaks in July with no water and no reason to. I was tracking a body now, and some part of me had known that since the river, since the single knee print, since the wallet lying open with its mouth to the sky. But knowing a thing and admitting it are 2 different countries, and I had not yet crossed the border. I found where he had fallen the first time near a dry wash in the middle of the afternoon, not fallen and gotten up, fallen and crawled. The tracks changed, the boot prints stopped, and there began instead the terrible signature of a man moving on his hands and knees, and then on his belly, dragging, and I got down off my horse, and I followed that trail on foot with my heart going in my chest like a fist on a door, because a man crawling is a man still trying, and something in me could not bear it and could not stop. I found him in the shade of a cutbank where the wash made a slow turn, and he was alive. I want to let that sit, because it sat hard on me. 3 days, no water, a country that kills strong men in one. And Silas Renner was alive, barely, terribly, his lips gone black and his eyes swollen half shut and his breath coming in a dry click like something winding down, but alive, curled in the only patch of shade for a mile as if the land itself had relented at the last and cupped one hand around him. I have thought a great deal about how he lived. The doctor I would talk to later had a word for it, said something about the cool of the cutbank and the man's condition and a dozen small mercies of chance. But I was there, and I will tell you what I believe, which is that Silas Renner lived because some animal part of him had refused the thing the rest of him had decided. He had walked out here to die. I am as sure of that as I am of anything. And then some deeper stubbornness had crawled him into the shade, had made him dig his fingers into the cool sand, had kept the click going in his chest hour after hour past every reason to stop. The same blind endurance that had gotten him up every morning for 3 years to ranch a place he no longer cared about, the body simply refusing to quit on a man whose spirit already had. I got water into him a little at a time, the way you have to, and I wet a rag and laid it over his cracked lips and let him suck at it, and I talked to him the whole while though he could not answer, told him my name, told him I had his wallet, told him a great deal of nonsense in the low, steady voice you use on a spooked horse. And after a long time his eyes came open the rest of the way and found my face, and there was in them not gratitude, which is what a man expects, but something else entirely, something that stopped me cold. He looked at me like I had done him a wrong. "You shouldn't have," he said. It took him 3 tries to make the words. His voice was a ruin. "You shouldn't have come." I told him to hush and drink. He drank, but his eyes stayed on me, and there was a terrible clarity coming up in them as the water reached him, the clarity of a man returning to a decision he had made and finding it undone by a stranger, and I understood that I had not rescued Silas Renner. I had interrupted him, and a part of him hated me for it, the pure animal hatred of a man dragged back from the one door he had finally worked up the courage to walk through. I have been on both sides of that door. I did not take it personally. We stayed in the cutbank through the worst of the heat, and by evening he could sit up, and by full dark he could talk, and what he told me came out slow and then all at once, the way a wound bleeds when you finally take the pressure off it, and I sat and listened and did not once tell him it would be all right, because I did not believe it would be, and he would have known I was lying. His boy had died of the fever 3 winters back. That much Elmore had told me true. But Elmore had not known the rest, because Silas had told no one the rest, had carried it alone for 3 years the way he carried the wallet, close and hidden and worn smooth with handling. On the night the boy died, Silas had ridden for the doctor. The same road, the same river crossing. And the doctor had been 3 days gone to another county, and Silas had ridden back knowing he was bringing nothing, and he had gotten home in the gray of the morning to find that the boy had died in the night, in Mercy's arms, calling for his father who was not there. And Mercy had looked up at him in the doorway with the dead child in her lap, and she had said, "Silas told me this," staring straight ahead into the dark. In a voice with nothing left in it, she had said, "Where were you? Where were you?" And he had never been able to answer her. For 3 years he had slept in the barn rather than answer her. Because the answer was that he had been out on a road doing the only thing he knew how to do, which was to try, and it had not been enough. And a man can survive almost anything except the knowledge that his best effort was worth nothing at the one moment it was needed. And now, Silas said, she's sick with the same fever, and I rode for the doctor again, same road, same river, and halfway there I got down to water the horse and I thought. He stopped. In the dark I could hear him breathing, the click almost gone now, replaced by something worse, the wet, unsteady breath of a man at the edge of weeping who has forgotten how. I thought, I can't do it again. I can't ride back into that house. If she dies while I'm gone and I come home and there's her face, I can't. I'd rather die on the road than be the man who comes home too late twice. So I turned the horse loose, and I walked, and I meant to keep walking till I couldn't. He turned his head and looked at me, and there was just enough starlight to see it. "You understand what that makes me," he said. "I left her. She's lying in that house burning up and calling my name, and I turned my horse loose and walked into the desert to die because I was too much of a coward to sit beside her and watch. That's the secret, mister. That's what you rode all this way to find out. I'm not lost. I'm not hurt. I ran. There's a woman dying of thirst for the sight of me, and I ran the other way. Now you know. Now you can leave me the way you found me." I did not say anything for a while. The stars wheeled. Somewhere off in the breaks, a coyote asked its one question of the night and got no answer, the way it never does. And then I told Silas Renner the thing I had never told anyone, the trouble I had been not quite mentioning since the first road. The reason his knee print had fit the shape of mine. I had a wife once. I have mentioned her, the one who called my needing to know a curse. Her name is not important to this, and I find I still cannot set it down on a page, which after all these years tells me something about myself I would rather not know. She got sick. Not a fever, the slow kind, the kind that takes a year and takes it in installments, so that you have time, which everyone tells you is a mercy and which is in fact the cruelest part because you watch it come. And I was in those days a man much like Silas, a trier, a man who believed that effort was a kind of currency and that if he only worked hard enough, rode far enough, wanted it badly enough, he could buy back anything. So I worked. I took every job. I told myself I was providing, building something, that the money mattered, that being gone was a form of love. And I was gone. I was gone the way a man is gone who cannot bear to be present, and I dressed it up as duty, and I rode away from that house 100 times when what she needed was for me to sit down in it and hold her hand and be afraid alongside her instead of being afraid somewhere else where she couldn't see. And one time I rode away, and while I was gone she died. Alone. With a neighbor woman, a kind one, but not me. And I came home too late, the way Silas had come home too late, and there was no one in the doorway to say, "Where were you?" which was worse, because I had to say it to myself, and I have been saying it every day since. "So I know," I told Silas out there in the dark. "I know exactly the man you think you are. I've been him 20 years, and I'm going to tell you the thing I wish to God somebody had ridden into the desert and told me. You didn't run because you're a coward. You ran because you love her so much you can't survive watching. Those aren't the same thing." It took me 20 years and a stranger's wallet in the road to learn the difference, and I'm not going to let you take 20 years to learn it because you don't have 20 years. She's alive right now. Mine wasn't. That's the whole distance between you and me, Silas. Yours is still breathing, and you can still be in the doorway. He was crying by then. So, I will admit, was I two grown men in the bottom of a dry wash under all those indifferent stars, weeping over the same wound from opposite ends of it. But here is where the thing turned, and turned in a way I did not see coming, and I have gone over it 1,000 times, and I still do not know if I did right. Because Silas could not walk, not out of the breaks, not the day and a half back to Coldwater, not any distance that mattered. He had walked in on the last of his strength, and there was none left. Getting him even to the river crossing was going to be a slow, brutal business of putting him on cinnamon and leading her over ground that would take us the better part of 2 days at a crawl. And the doctor was already at the ranch, with Mercy, had been for days. Which meant the choice in front of me was not the simple one it should have been. It was not save the man, reunite the family, ride home to a grateful wife. The choice was this. I could spend 2 days hauling a half-dead Silas back toward a house where his wife might already be dead, might have died, in fact, in the very hours I sat listening to him, and deliver to that woman, if she lived, the husband who had abandoned her. Or I could ride hard and alone, right now, leave Silas in the cutbank with water and shade and what supplies I had, and reach the ranch myself in a day and be there. Be in the doorway. So that whatever happened, Mercy Renner would not be alone the way my wife had been alone, the way the boy had died with no father's hand to hold. I could not undo my own history, but I was being handed, out here in the dark, a chance to do for a stranger's wife the one thing I had failed to do for my own. And to take that chance, I would have to leave a dying man alone in the desert on the strength of a promise to come back for him. The same desert, alone, the very thing that had nearly killed him. I would have to do to Silas, in a sense, the exact thing that had broken us both. I sat with that until the stars began to pale. I am not going to pretend I reasoned my way to an answer. I don't think it was reason. Somewhere in the gray before dawn, I simply stood up, and I knew, the way I had known at the wallet, the way I had known at the store, that I was going to do the harder thing and probably the wrong one, because it was the only thing I could hold in the same 2 hands as everything else. I told Silas the plan. He fought me on it, which I expected, and with more strength than I thought he had, which I did not. "You can't leave me out here," he said, and there was raw fear in it, the fear of a man who had walked into this place to die and now, having been given his life back, discovered he wanted it. That was its own small miracle, and I noted it even in the middle of everything. "And you can't tell her you found me. You can't. If she's alive, mister, if she's alive and you tell her I ran, it'll kill her surer than the fever. Don't tell her. Let her think I got lost, thrown, anything. Don't you tell her I ran." And there it was, the morally heavy thing, the choice under the choice. Because I was going to ride to that woman's bedside, and she was going to look up at me the way Mercy Renner looked up at everyone now, from the far side of one dead child and toward the possibility of a dead husband. And she was going to ask me, I knew she would ask me, where he was. And I was going to have to decide in that moment whether to hand a dying woman the comfort of a lie or the dignity of the truth. I have opinions about lying. I told you at the start I have decided a story told by a liar isn't worth the breath. I believe that. And I stood in the dawn looking down at Silas Renner, who was asking me to make his wife's last hours a lie, to protect him, and I understood that he was not asking to protect himself. He was asking because he could not bear for the last thing Mercy ever thought of him to be that he had abandoned her twice. He was trying, even now, even ruin, to give her something. It was the most human and the most cowardly thing I ever heard a man ask, and they were the same request, and I could not separate them any more than I could separate the money from the photograph. "I'll do what's right when I get there," I told him, which was not a yes and was not a no and was the most honest thing I had. Then I filled every container I had with what water I could spare him, and I put him in the deepest shade. And I told him I would be back inside 3 days with a wagon. And I looked him in the eye when I said it, because a man deserves to be looked at when you're either saving his life or lying to his face, and you don't yet know which. And I got on my horse, and I rode away, and left a dying man alone in the desert, which is a thing I had sworn on the grave I never visit that I would never do to another living soul. The sun came up behind me. It threw my shadow out long ahead of me on the ground. A tall, thin rider pointed toward the ranch, toward Mercy, toward the doorway I had failed to stand in once and was riding like hell to stand in now. And I did not know, could not know, would not know for another day and a half, whether I was riding toward a living woman or a dead one, toward a chance at grace or just a second version of the same old failure. That is the country part 2 leaves me in, riding hard, not knowing, a wallet in my breast pocket and a lie or a truth waiting for me at the end of the road, and no way to tell until I got there which one I was carrying. The Renner place came up out of the land the way such places do, all at once, after miles of nothing. A plank house gone silver with weather, a barn leaning slightly into the prevailing wind, a windmill turning, a wagon in the yard with a team still in the traces that I knew must be the doctor's. My heart went hard and small at the sight of that wagon, because a doctor whose team is still hitched is a doctor who has not yet decided he can leave. And a doctor who cannot leave is either winning or losing, and you cannot tell which from the yard. I had ridden through the night. Cinnamon was done, head low, and so was I, and I got down in the yard on legs that had stopped being legs somewhere in the dark, and the front door opened before I reached it, and a man came out wiping his hands on a rag. The doctor, gray, tired, with the particular stillness of a man who has spent days at a bedside and learned to move quietly whether or not there is any longer a reason to. He looked at me, a stranger alone, half dead off a ruined horse come out of the wrong direction. I did not have Sela's. I saw him take that in, saw him look past me at the empty saddle, at the country I'd come from, and understand that whatever I was not the husband, and that I had come from the direction the husband had vanished into. "Is she alive?" I said. It was all I had. He looked at me a moment longer. Then he said, "The fever broke last night. She's weak as a kitten and she'll be a month getting her strength, but she's going to live." He paused. "Which is more than I can say I expected 3 days ago. She's a stubborn woman. She had no business surviving that, and she did it anyway, mostly, I think, because she wasn't finished waiting for something." He said the last part carefully, watching me, and I understood he was asking a question without asking it. Behind him, from inside the dim house, a voice came, thin, cracked with sickness and disuse, but clear, and it said, "Who is it? Is it him? Doctor, is it him?" And I stood in that yard with the whole thing come down to this single point, a wallet in my breast pocket and a dying man alive in the desert behind me and a woman who wasn't finished waiting just through that door. And I had to decide, right then, with no more time to think about it, what I was carrying into her house. I went in. The house was 1 room and a lean-to, and it was clean in the desperate way of a house kept clean by grief. And there were the boys' things. I saw them at once, could not have not seen them. A small pair of boots by the cold stove, a wooden horse on a shelf, a child's chair pulled up to the table where no child sat. 3 years. She had kept it all 3 years. And in the bed against the far wall, propped on pillows, thinner than the photograph and grayer and older, but unmistakably her, unmistakably Mercy, was the woman I had carried in my breast pocket across 40 miles of hell. Her eyes found me, and I watched the hope in them break against the fact of my strangeness. She did not know me. She had heard a horse and let herself believe, for the length of one held breath, and now here was only a stranger, and I saw her begin the terrible practiced work of putting the hope away again, folding it small, the way she must have folded it 100 times a day for 3 years. "You're not him," she said. "No, ma'am." "Do you know where he is?" And there it was. The question I had known she would ask, the fork in the whole road, Silas's plea in one hand, "Don't tell her I ran," and the truth in the other, and Elmore's warning underneath it all, "Be careful what you carry back to her." I stood at the foot of a dying, no, a living woman's bed, and I opened my mouth not knowing which would come out, and I will tell you honestly that I did not decide. It decided itself, the way the photograph had decided itself over the money, some deeper part of me choosing before the thinking part could ruin it. "I know exactly where he is," I said. "He's alive. He's hurt and he's weak, but he's alive, and there's a wagon going out for him at first light, and he's coming home." Her whole body changed. I have never seen anything like it, and I never expect to again. The way life came back into a face I had watched preparing itself for death. The way she pressed one thin hand over her mouth and made no sound at all, because I think she had no sound left, had spent it all, and could only sit there shaking with the enormous silent force of a hope she had thought she'd buried. And then into that, before I could stop it or shape it, she asked the second question, the real one. "What happened to him?" she said. "Where has he been?" Here is the truth of what I did, and I have never been proud of it, and I have never once regretted it. And I have made my peace with holding those two things at the same time, because I have learned that most of the real decisions of a life are like that. I did not lie to her, but I did not tell her all of it either. I told her that Silas had ridden for the doctor. That much was true, and she knew it, had likely watched him go. I told her that his horse had thrown him at the river crossing, which was not true. The horse had been turned loose, but she would never know the difference, and neither would the horse. I told her he had been hurt and disoriented, and had wandered off into the breaks, lost, which was true in every way that mattered and false only in the one way that would have destroyed her. And I told her, and this was the truest thing I said, truer than the facts, the kind of true that facts can't reach. I told her that in 3 days alone in that desert, with every reason to give up, her husband had refused to die. That something in him had crawled into the shade and held on past all sense and all endurance. That he had fought his way back toward her with the last of everything he had. All of which was true, every word. I had seen the crawl marks. I had seen the knee print. I had seen a man who walked out to die and then, when it came to it, could not stop his own body from trying to live. And if you had asked me to swear on it, I would have said that the trying was for her, that somewhere under the despair the animal in him was crawling home. And I believe that, I choose to believe that, and no one alive can prove me wrong. What I did not tell her was why he had wandered. I did not tell her that he had chosen the breaks over her doorway. I did not tell her that a man can love a woman so much he'd rather die in a ditch than watch her die in a bed, and that the loving and the leaving can be the same act, and that her husband had done both to her twice. I took Silas's secret, the one he had carried for 3 years and tried to die with, and I did not carry it to her. I set it down in that desert, and I left it there beside his knee print, and I like to think that was the one clean thing I did in the whole business. Because here is what I had finally understood, riding through that night. The truth is owed to the living, but so is mercy, and when they conflict you have to choose, and I had spent 20 years believing that a man who chooses mercy over truth is just a coward with a nicer name for it. I do not believe that anymore. I looked at Mercy Renner and I understood that some truths are not medicine but simply more knife, and that a woman who has buried a son and nearly followed him is owed her husband back whole, not shattered into the shape of the man who ran. Let Silas tell her himself someday, if he ever finds the courage. Or let him not. That was between the two of them and the long years they'd have now to work it out. It was not mine to force. I took the wallet out of my breast pocket and I put it in her hands. She knew it the instant she touched it, the way Elmore had known it, The way you know a thing your own hands have made. She had stitched it, that first hard winter, the oak leaves and all. She turned it over and her fingers found the worn places where 20 years of Silas's thumb had rubbed the leaves soft, and she pressed it against her chest. And that was when she finally made a sound, one low broken sound, and I had to look away and study the boy's small boots by the cold stove until I could trust my own face again. "He never set it down," she said. "In 20 years, he never once set it down." "No, ma'am," I said. "He set it down once, in the road, where somebody was sure to find it." And I did not explain that, and she did not ask, and I have wondered ever since how much she understood in that moment. Whether some part of a wife who has slept alone 3 years while her husband slept in the barn knew exactly what it meant for a man to finally set down the one thing he never set down, and chose, the way I had chosen, to leave that particular truth lying in the dirt where it belonged. I think she knew. I have come to believe she knew everything always. The way the woman in the photograph had looked like someone enduring a thing she had not yet told anyone. I think Mercy Renner knew her husband had run, knew it before I said a word, knew it the moment his horse came back without him, and I think what she needed from me was not the facts, which she already had, but permission to want him back anyway. And I gave her that. That was the thing I carried in from the desert that was worth carrying, not the wallet, the permission. The doctor's man took the wagon out at first light, with directions I drew in the dirt of the yard, and they found Silas where I'd left him alive and brought him home 2 days later. I was not there for it. I have thought about that a great deal, that I left before the reunion, that I did not stay to see the man I'd pulled from the desert carried through the doorway I'd been so desperate to reach. But I found I could not stay. I do not entirely know why. Or I do know, and it is only that I could not bear to watch a homecoming so like the one I never had, could not stand in that yard and see Silas carried into Mercy, while my own house stood empty 40 years and a lifetime away. So I left before the wagon came back. I filled my canteens at their well, and I put Cinnamon's head toward the trouble I had been riding toward at the very start of all this. You will remember I mentioned it, the thing up the road I was riding to before the wallet turned me, and I have decided that trouble is not part of this story, that it belongs to another one, and maybe I'll tell it and maybe I won't. Some roads a man keeps to himself. But before I rode out, Mercy called me back to the bed and took my hand in both of her thin ones, and she looked at me with those enduring eyes and she said, "You didn't tell me everything." It was not an accusation. I want to be clear. It was the gentlest thing anyone has said to me in years. "No, ma'am," I said, "I didn't." "Good," she said, and she pressed my hand once hard and let it go. "A person can carry more than they let on. I've been doing it 3 years. She looked toward the boy's boots by the stove. "You learn to hold the heavy thing and let folks see only what they can bear of it. That's not lying. That's just carrying." And I understood that she had absolved me before I'd even confessed, that she'd seen straight through to the shape of what I'd done and named it kinder than I ever could have named it myself. And I had to leave the house quickly then, out into the white morning, because a man has his limits and I had reached mine. I have carried this a long time, longer than I've carried most things, and I have carried a great deal. I never went back to the Renner place. I heard, years later, from a cattle buyer who'd passed through Ash Fork that Silas Renner had recovered, that he'd moved out of the barn and back into the house, that the two of them had been seen in the churchyard the spring after, standing a long time at a small grave together, his arm around her. That is all I know. It is enough. I did not need to see it. I only needed to know it happened, that somewhere a doorway that had stood empty got a man standing in it at last, even if it was not mine and never could be. I have thought about why the wallet was lying open. I told you at the start that a wallet does not fall open on a road, that it is set down, deliberately, by a man who has decided he won't need it. And I believe that. But I have come to believe one thing more, and I offer it to you not as fact but as the thing I have chosen to hold. I think some part of Silas, the same stubborn animal part that later crawled him into the shade, set that wallet down open in the road on purpose, not to be rid of it, but to be found. I think a man walking into the desert to die does not leave the one thing his wife made him lying where anyone could see it unless some buried, unkillable part of him is leaving a marker. Come find me. Come find me. The same thing the note on the photograph said, turned around. He set it down as a way of not entirely letting go, and the road gave it to me, and I could have kept the money and ridden on and let him have his death, and instead the photograph won, the way it wins, and I went and found the thing a man had left to be found. That is the secret if you want one. Not that Silas ran. Everybody runs, one way or another, from the doorways they can't bear to stand in. The secret is that even the running part of us leaves a marker. Even the part that's walking away sets something down in the road open, where it might be found, on the chance that somebody fool enough and broke enough and haunted enough to answer it comes along. I was that fool. I have been glad of it exactly once, and once I have decided is enough. I still have the boy's tooth. I never gave it back. I meant to. It was in the wallet, wrapped in its blue scrap of cloth, and I took it out that first night to look at it, and I put it in my own pocket meaning to return it with everything else, and then I did not, and then it was too late, and now it rides with me still, in the deep pocket where I keep the things I cannot set down. I tell myself Silas has enough. He has mercy, and the house, and the grave they stand at together, and the years they got that I did not. I tell myself a man can spare one small tooth to a stranger who has nothing. But that is not the reason, and I know it is not the reason. The reason is that a long time ago I did not sit at a bedside I should have sat at, and there was no small thing left over for me to carry. No tooth, no photograph, no wallet worn soft with 20 years of holding. There was just an empty house and a grave I have never once been able to make myself visit. And now, in the deep pocket, there is this. Somebody else's grief, that I stole off a road, that I have decided to carry the rest of my life, because carrying it is the closest I will ever come to having sat in the chair I did not sit in. I take it out sometimes at night, when the country goes quiet in that way that presses. I unwrap the blue cloth. I hold the small thing in my palm, and I think about a boy I never met calling for a father who wasn't there, and a woman who kept his boots by the stove for 3 years, and a man who walked into the desert and left a marker in the road, and a stranger broke enough to answer it. And I think I answered one. In a whole life of riding away from the doorways, I answered one. It is not enough. Nothing is enough. But it is one, and I set it down here in the road open where you have found it.